Thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk, Robert. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome you to the final session of the ACFID conference, and again, kudos really to Mark Purcell and the team at ACFID. It has been a fantastic couple of days, and thank you all for staying until the bitter end. We very much appreciate it. We have a fantastic group of speakers for you now. Robert, who you've just heard from. We also have Professor Jane McAdam. So Jane is a Professor of Law and the Director of the Andrew and Renata Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales. She was selected as a visiting fellow at the Harvard Law School Human Rights Program for 2017-18. Professor McAdam serves on a number of international committees, including as co-rapporteur of the International Law Association's Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise, a member of the Advisory Committee on the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and a member of the Advisory Council on the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion. We also have Habib. Habib is the founder and spokesperson for the Australian Burmese Rohingya organisation based in Melbourne. An ex-detainee himself, Habib co-authored Taboo Burmese, which was published in 2012, and then updated and renamed First They Erased Our Names in 2017. And also we have Dr. Pedersen. Dr. Morten is a senior lecturer in international politics and human rights at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, with the Australian Defence Force Academy, and a former senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Myanmar. And we're also thrilled to return to the stage Sanam, who was our keynote speaker from yesterday. So welcome and thank you very much. So when I was thinking about what this panel, the kind of things that we could discuss, we really want to fundamentally unpack this tension that I think we're all still grappling about when it comes to looking at human rights on one hand and humanitarian action on the other. Some see human rights as the result of effective humanitarian action. Some see human rights as being incompatible with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. So do we or can we choose between a needs-based approach or a rights-based approach? The World Humanitarian Summit promoted a convergence of several agendas, which some humanitarian agencies, such as Médecins Sans Frontières, have rejected fundamentally. So our panel today, we're going to explore these tensions and the different perspectives on this critical relationship. And I hope that you will join with us after we have a short moderated discussion in asking some very juicy questions of our panel members. So I think it makes sense to start with Robert. We've just heard a fantastic talk. You've given us some amazing statistics also about where we're going with climate change. And it's quite terrifying. And I liked how you talked about the fact that we're at this critical juncture at the moment. So could you outline a bit for us in the face of these enormous challenges? Who are some of the non-traditional actors, and we've spoken a little about China, but if we could just explore some of the non-traditional approaches and actors that ACFID members could be engaging with, and also what are some of the risks that they may face in doing so?
Well, you've just heard me speak for over 20 minutes, so I'll keep my comments brief. But yeah, I think if we believe, as I believe, that this world that we're entering is going to be unprecedentedly difficult, both because of climate and because of the political context and how they reinforce each other, then, you know, I hate to use the analogy of the monks that are preserving the books, you know, during the Dark Ages, but there is a sense that a question about how we keep this spark of humanitarianism, of rights, of multilateral approaches, of poverty as a focus as opposed to narrow national self-interest, how we keep that alive. And I think it's going to require us to develop alliances with organizations that we don't often, that have similar thinking, but maybe with either a domestic focus rather than an international focus, or a rights-based focus. So I think the idea of building coalitions in this environment and of developing narratives that can be supported by a whole variety of different organizations with different core missions is going to be really key. So I think the coalitions are really important. I think the threats are the ones that I mentioned earlier. We're going to see aid being used, for example, or the pressure on funding to be used to either to win hearts and minds, to use an old Vietnam War era expression, in our countries to in our region, or to redirect funding from international purposes to Australia, domestic purposes, or to use the funding to do things like build walls, which I guess is the equivalent of Nauru and PNG, camps in Nauru and PNG. So for me, it's the narrative becomes key, and the coalitions that we need to be building both in Australia and globally.
Thank you. And I think that what you've just mentioned about climate change, and you're mentioning, you know, PNG and also Nauru, moving to Jane, in the face of these kind of challenges and looking specifically at displacement, can you outline for us the impact that this is already happening right now, some of the challenges that we're facing and the scale that we're really looking at?
Yes, well, every second somebody is displaced by the impacts of a disaster or climate change. And annually, we're looking at figures of around 19 million people. In fact, what we now know is that there are far more people being displaced by disasters than by conflict, at least within countries. We don't have the statistics available on cross-border movement, but the fact that 61% of people are moving on account of disasters versus 39% by conflict should make us sit up and think, do the normative frameworks we have in place and the national responses that governments have in their migration policy, among other things, address this sufficiently? And the short answer is no, they don't. There are, however, some positive developments that we've seen at the global level, at the regional level, and also at the national level. And if I can just highlight an example of each of those. At the national level, at the international level, in 2020, the Swiss government, in partnership with the Norwegian government, created something called the Nansen Initiative on Disaster-Induced Cross-Border Displacement. And when they founded that initiative, which was an intergovernmental process, also involving stakeholder consultations with affected communities, experts, technical assistance, and so on, just a handful of other governments were interested. But 3 years later, when they launched what's known as their protection agenda, which set out a roadmap for what's needed in terms of holistic solutions and approaches, 109 governments endorsed that. And that work's now being followed through by the replacement organisation called the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Just briefly, regionally, Central American governments recognised that all of them were affected by disaster displacement, and it was much better to have a coordinated response rather than an ad hoc one. So in 2016, they developed some guidelines on how they would respond in disaster situations to assist each other's nationals who moved across borders. And at the national level, Vanuatu this year released the first climate change and disaster displacement policy, which again sets out a national roadmap for how that government is seeking to address the issue and build in preemptive strategies to help people.
Thank you very much. And it's only fitting to ask Sanam, considering today it's been 18 years since she was involved in drafting UN Security Council Resolution 1325, about how with all this mass displacement going on, the security implications that had, and really trying to unpack the role that women's leadership can play in addressing some of these issues. So how do you think, in the very most difficult context, what is this looking like?
So thank you. I feel like a prophet of doom actually at the moment, because what I see is that these things coming together, the displacement and the violence that goes together, we are criminalizing humanity in all of these places, right? So, and the problem in terms, and the tragedy is that not only human rights defenders are being attacked, environmental activists are being attacked, civic activists are being attacked. In Colombia, they had the peace agreement in 2016. In 2017, they had over 120 civic activists murdered. This year alone, up to now, 180 have been killed, right? Global Witness tells us that in 2017 was the deadliest year for environmental activists. So if you become an activist, you are under attack from your own government and from the forces of agribusiness and other things, which is actually one of the biggest killers in the space that we're talking about. So then, layer that in terms of talking about women specifically, what we see is that, women are always at the front lines of dealing with these things. They're very, very invisible. We don't pay attention to them. We don't think of them as actors. I mentioned this yesterday. We just don't see them, and we don't talk to them. We don't ask them what's going on and how they're dealing and what they're coping with. But when they come under attack, it's got a double layer because it's also related to sexual violence. So it's sexual violence and murder or sexual, threats of that nature or threats on their families. So we need in addition to everything else that's going on, the best people in our societies are at the moment being treated the absolute worst you can imagine. And if they disappear, what are we left with? Right? And this is where, in a sense, the humanitarian, the human rights, the development, all of it comes together. It is political. We have to be involved in this space. And if it's happening over there, wherever over there is, it's going to come to us, to those of us who live in the countries that we live in, America, Australia, etc. Because this criminalization of activism is something that we talked about at Civil Society Spaces Closing, but we're seeing it around this nexus of environmental activism, human rights activism, and so forth. So I'm sorry to sort of bring a sort of a downer, but it's a reality that's out there, and it's something that as a community, as a collective community, we need to be elevating our voices around.
Thank you. And I suppose if we take what you're saying and we overlay it onto the context that Habib is the most familiar with, and looking at the situation in Myanmar and Bangladesh, Habib, with your particular perspective as a leader from the Rohingya community, what are your views on how the protection of human rights should be taking place, both in Bangladesh and still in Myanmar?
Yeah.
I think you have a microphone next to you.
I'll look at the overall picture of displacement and killing. So we are talking about more than 700,000 people displaced and forced into Bangladesh, and the past arrival, so it is about nearly 1 million population. And then killing number, if you count the number of orphan, more than 40,000 orphan and widows and family member, so the death toll is more than 60,000 from June 2012. So the burning villages total more than 400 villages across 13 different townships, not just the crisis from 25th August 2017, but from June 2012. So it is about 90% of total Rohingya population has been displaced, and there is very brutality. Women and ladies, they've been raped in front of their family member in the public. The people has been tied up, burned alive, and thrown into the water. So very brutality. So only Rohingya, the victim, they can feel how they've been treated. So we are talking about 1 million population that is close to or about the population of the Adelaide in Australia. So we cannot find the right justice. Because today you see the government, the politician, the monks, and the majority public, they jointly denying the very existence of Rohingya. So what should be done in this place? So safety and security and their livelihood is very at risk. And the state is sponsoring, the state is the one, the government is the one that the main perpetrator of the ethnic cleansing, war crime, and genocide. The UN fact-finding machine and also the, including with one of the Australian former detective, the investigator, they have utterly ruled out to call genocide. So in this case, what my view is like international mechanism, the resolution, such as like for safety and the dignity for Rohingya people before they start repatriation or before they talk about anything. So the citizenship right must be ensured, and then relocation to the origin places, and also rehabilitation, and also lifting all kind of restriction. That should be done. That means improvement on the ground, situation on the ground is required. So we have to see this fast with the people, those are in Burma. I mean, the people, those are in 150,000 people are still trapped in 42 concentration camps since June 2012. They are still in the camp. They've been blocked from outside world. They are blocked also in there. So they are very segregated nature. Their livelihood, education, medication, and everything has been banned. Everything is blocked. So the people are there, wait for run from there, or they will be wait for die in there. So the situation has to be whatever they say. There has to be a start from there. Then we can see if there is any kind of improvement. Then they can start talking about repatriation. Even Aung San Suu Kyi government has signed MOU with UNHCR, UNDP, and again bilateral agreement with Bangladeshi government. But there has been nothing has been improved on the ground. It's just to topple international pressure to avoid international prosecution. But indeed, if you look the figure of the crime that the government has done from the past and the present, it is not only about because of Rohingya. You see a refugee population in Kachin, Karen, Shan, in Malaysia, Thailand, everywhere. They all are minority. They all are non-Buddhist community. Why? They not only target Rohingya, they target other Muslim as well. You see, after June 2012, the attack that spread across the other region in central Burma. They attack in 5 other townships, 5 other states. So that means they target non-Buddhist community, mostly minority. So that has to be solved. That has to be addressed. So from the past and the present, the government, this military-led government, they've been never prosecuted. That has to be prosecuted by internationally interference. This is time for internationally interference. So Australia, as a member of Security Council member, and also like we from Australia, we can do a lot of things. For example, what the victim, the Rohingya people needed justice. And second thing, humanitarian assistance and education in the camp. The third thing, highlighting their matter. They are Rohingya, they are refugees. Like we are seeing in Bangladesh, they are not documented as a Rohingya. Their identity has been written, displaced person from Myanmar. It's like very diplomatic word they use, displaced person. And then not Rohingya. You know, they are mentioned, they are not refugees. Their identity and their fact has been dismissed. And again, in Bangladesh refugee camp, they are in need of humanitarian assistance and education. Some the school leaders and some other people, community, they want to run their own school, teaching Burmese, teaching English. They want to run the model schools such as, but they're not getting fund for what they want to run to in there. And again, we have people trapped in Burma, like in 150,000, those in the camp, and outside another 200,000. They all needed assistance. So international community, United Nations agency, they're not even using power to freely distribute the food on the ground. So how can we expect this mechanism will solve and address this issue? So I have doubts. So I would like to call, we need a strong, rigid action and then legitimate punishment for what they have done. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Habib. So that brings us to a great chance to talk to Morten around how do you think how we characterise what has happened in Myanmar, how does that shape our actual response to it? How do we connect the political to the practical when it comes to assisting those who've been persecuted and displaced, as well as seeking justice? I mean, why has the international community failed us again?
I think I have to start by saying it's difficult to follow Habib, right? Because Habib speaks with the authority of representing. Okay. Does this help?
Use Habib's.
Does this help? Yeah. That helps. Okay. What I was trying to say is that it's a very difficult place to follow Habib because he, of course, speaks with the authority of the victims of these crimes that we are all by now very well aware of. I'm an outsider, I'm a foreigner, even worse, I'm an academic, and who cares what academics think. A first comment, I think, there's a lot of people saying, why haven't we learned the lessons of Sri Lanka, the lessons of Darfur, the lessons of Rwanda? Why do we keep failing? I would just start by saying, I think those are not the most important lessons. The lessons we need to learn is from our previous efforts to promote human rights in Myanmar, because each case is unique. And unfortunately, we haven't, it seems, learned those lessons very well, would be my perspective. But to respond to your main question,
yes, what we call a crisis like this indeed has a huge influence on how we respond to it, right? So before, when we didn't have a very evocative term to describe the mistreatment of the Rohingyas, which has been going on for decades, not very much was done, at least not by the major players. Now that we do have an evocative term, whether it's genocide, it's ethnic cleansing, or the more sort of run-of-the-mill crimes against humanity, now we see a lot of pressure for things to be done. But my worry is that at least some of that pressure is misdirected. It seems to me that for a lot of actors today, it has become more about being seen to do the right thing than actually doing good. And I worry that in the process we might actually end up doing harm. And let me just give a couple of examples of that. First of all, there is now a strong focus on criminal prosecution, right? Specifically on the International Criminal Court. And the idea with that, of course, as Habib talked about, is that this will provide justice for the victims of the violence, at least from last year. The problem is that the International Criminal Court has actually never been able to bring to justice anyone from a country that doesn't cooperate with the court. And I can tell you, the Myanmar government is not cooperating. So with that in mind, I worry that the push for criminal prosecution may in fact end up doing more harm than good. And I'm particularly concerned that it may block some of the very important changes that we have to see on the ground. The Myanmar generals know that when you are being investigated by the International Criminal Court, which is now happening, the only way to stay safe is to stay in power. And I can guarantee you that they will be even less prepared to consider further democratic change now than they were before. And that certainly doesn't serve anyone. A related issue, and possibly a related problem, is the push towards sanctions. And this is where I talked about earlier that we don't seem to have learned the lessons of the past, because we have had 20 years of international sanctions on the previous military government over human rights issues. And those 20 years of sanctions achieved, to my mind, absolutely nothing, except to deny ordinary people jobs, aid, etc., that they very much needed. I think the fundamental problem here is that once we see a situation, a country, through the lens of mass atrocities, then the natural human impulse is to look towards punishment, towards what we might call retributive justice. The problem with that is that once we do that, the main focus becomes about exposing crimes, about identifying perpetrators, and much less time is spent trying to understand why the violations happened in the first place, what the underlying causes of the violence is, and what we might do that would in fact help the Rohingya in their normal lives. So, to go back where I started, once we call something genocide or ethnic cleansing, whatever it might be, there seems to be a tendency to head off on a particular tangent, which I, however understandable this is, worry will not in the end help the Rohingya. Whether we are talking about the 700,000 that are stuck in the camps in Bangladesh, or the 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 that are essentially stuck inside the country. And in fact, it sounds like living under even worse conditions than the people in the camps.
So if I move to you, Robert, in terms of looking at these kinds of complex emergencies, like what's happening in Myanmar and in Bangladesh, there is a lot of concern still about the politicisation of aid, specifically looking at humanitarian action. How do you think we can get the balance right between delivering effective humanitarian action, but also upholding a human rights agenda?
Ooh, boy, there's so many angles on this issue. I was thinking of, at the UN level, the context where you have pressures in the UN from member states to have unified UN missions in some of these complex emergencies, where you have the humanitarian piece with the military and the political piece. And of course, that means the humanitarian is third on the list of importance, and also raises questions about whether it is perceived as being neutral in a situation. So that's one. Of course, the politicization has been there for a long time in a whole variety of tensions in development. You know, if you look at where the US sends its ODA, it's hard to make an argument on poverty grounds to be funding Israel to the extent it's being funded. Or we also see examples of humanitarian aid working with governments where the governments are manipulating the aid or only allowing aid to be used to support parts of the country that support the government in a conflict. Or the challenges of aid agencies providing funding in these complex emergencies where there are enormous human rights violations, but agencies decide, rightly or wrongly, often wrongly, I think, that they won't speak out because they're thinking, if we speak out, we won't be able to access these people who are in enormous need. Or agencies that decide to work where it's easiest to work rather than trying to think about where the needs are greatest, the humanitarian needs are greatest, which is linked to, just to unpack it as you've asked, is linked to what the risks are to safety and security of staff and whether insurance coverage exists, because there's a due diligence requirement for agencies as well. So yeah, anyway, those are a few angles on this. The only other point I'd make is that these challenges will become greatly magnified in the years ahead for the reasons I mentioned in my opening remarks.
And that's a perfect segue into my next question, because yes, looking at climate change, Jane has illustrated beautifully what kind of things are happening now when we're looking at the scale of displacement. So Jane, could I ask you what you think the most pressing priorities are that need to be addressed in the future to deal with climate-induced displacement? And what impact do you think the Global Compact for Migration is going to have in this particular area?
I think the overarching pressing priority is mitigation, but as we heard from Robert's talk, even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions now, that's not enough to halt some of the disastrous adverse impacts that we're already seeing and are likely to continue to see. I think when it comes to what needs to be done to address future displacement, the action needs to be happening now, because displacement's already happening now and climate change is likely to amplify that. We'll see disasters becoming disasters on steroids, for instance. A number of things that I'm going to highlight were not only part of the toolbox of the Nansen Initiative's protection agenda that I mentioned before, but in fact have been picked up in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, which you may know is to be adopted by the world's governments in December of this year. Perhaps I'll just explain a little more about that. It's not a legally binding document, but for the first time it does provide us with a comprehensive international set of commitments that governments have made, at least politically and morally, on migration as a whole. And what's fascinating there is that thanks to an 11th hour intervention by Pacific Island states, disasters, the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation are the only area that are singled out for special attention. So what's reflected there are the following: the need to have greater information gathering and sharing between states about what are these impacts that we're seeing, how are they playing out in different areas of the world, and how do we start to form a better understanding of these in terms of policy responses. Those policy responses need to include disaster risk reduction so that people are more resilient to face disasters, and if they are displaced, will hopefully be displaced for a shorter period of time or may in fact avoid being displaced at all. We need climate change adaptation strategies, again, for the same reasons. We also need to have governments start to think more about how migration and mobility can be part of adaptation to climate change. So the Pacific labour schemes that the Minister referred to are not designed specifically for that, but by some people in the Pacific are seen as an adaptation strategy, as a way of diversifying livelihoods, sending home remittances and the like. So to build on those in particular regional contexts will be very important. And also to open up other visa channels to people in particularly affected countries. So to make it easier to apply for family migration, skilled migration, migration for educational purposes and the like. We also need to have better humanitarian assistance that's attuned to the needs of people who will be displaced, whether that's within their own countries or across international borders. We need to consider planned relocations in certain instances, although we're well aware these can be very fraught based on past experiences. And at the moment, the only planned relocations that have occurred in this context have been within countries. Fiji is a good example, not yet across international borders. And I guess in all of this, we need governments to be cooperating more fully. A big thing behind the Global Compact on Migration is better and more equitable responsibility sharing, and that needs to underpin all of these efforts. In terms of what impact the Global Compact will have, well, that depends on what governments decide to do. There are actually good international legal principles underpinning a lot of what I've said, and yet even with those binding commitments, sadly we haven't seen the action that's needed. But one would hope that the political and moral commitments that states have made here, particularly in an environment where we may well have seen far lesser commitments being made, I think is something that we need to be positive about. And we've got a number of hooks for further advocacy in the global compacts that can be used to hold governments to account.
Thank you, Jane. You mentioned there the need for appropriate humanitarian assistance. And Sanam, I'd like to ask you, I've heard of many instances now where donor governments, in giving their humanitarian assistance, it is given under the guise of countering violent extremism. So I'd like to ask you a bit about the tension between those two agendas. And I mean, I've been told by donors, oh, but any kind of good humanitarian assistance is countering violent extremism. So what are your thoughts on that?
Again, I feel as if we're getting the worst of all worlds in a sense. And before I answer that, I just want to highlight two things. One, sanctions. So November 5th, Iran is going to be under imposed sanctions again. And already we're seeing the impact on the public. It's not on the regime. It is 100% on the public. And not only that, what happens is that they have a water problem right now. We have a massive water problem, and the questions of internal displacement are already happening. How can you engage if you have sanctions? If you're closing off a country of 80 million people in a very geostrategically important place? So it's really stupid. I mean, the narrative that we have from around the world that, oh, this is a terrorist regime or it's nuclear, whatever, this is the fake news, actually. And even if they are, in terms of security-wise, they're in the region doing whatever they're doing for their own interests, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaging. Because there are good elements and there are bad elements. But when you impose sanctions, all you're doing is elevating the worst possible elements and closing off that society and the state to other ways of engagement. So that's just one thing that, in terms of prevention, if we're thinking about, that's one thing to watch. The other point I wanted to make is that, in the Middle East, we've often heard about the China model. And the China model is what I feel as if this is where we're all moving towards, which is basically having an authoritarian state that has pretty much political control, enabling the economic space to open up, but that's moving us to what I call extreme capitalism, right? This incredible sort of inequality, and essentially not enabling the social space, the social movements, the engagements, and so forth. And that's what we're seeing, whether it's in Turkey or whether it's in Brazil or whether it's, frankly, in the US right now. We have to be really careful about this model of governance that we're all living with. Because now coming back to the countering violent extremism, if you think about it, what's happening around the world is that people are feeling disenfranchised. They're feeling angry, they're feeling marginalized, and so forth. And yet there is a connectivity. Somebody out there is pulling them in one direction or another. If I wanted to give you the example of what happened with the Rohingya crisis. In my network, in the network that we spearhead, we have partners in Indonesia and Pakistan, in the Philippines. when the news hit of the Rohingya expulsion into Bangladesh, our partners all around these countries were saying that in the mosques in their country, the message in the mosques was, you have to go and fight jihad in Myanmar, right? My Pakistani partner stopped a group of teenage boys from actually setting off and going, right? So that's your local leadership. That is, and why could she do that? Because she runs a school, because she knows these kids, because they trust her, she got the news. The families didn't even know about it. The families didn't even know that this was happening in the mosque on the corner of the street, basically. So, and it wasn't just there. As I say, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and elsewhere, they were being mobilized to go and fight for the cause of other Muslims. Did the Rohingya want them there? Maybe not. Probably not. Absolutely not, right? Doesn't matter. Somebody is exploiting the problem. So we have to understand what's happening in terms of the politics of these other actors. In terms of the humanitarian setting, back in 2012, our Syrian partners, literally they said, in the next 6 months, you will see extremism rise by 60%. We said, what's going on? They said, well, we've been asking for educational support for our families and for the kids in the camps and displacement and refugee settings. It's not coming from the international community. It came from Saudi Arabia. The school books from Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism was spread into those areas, and we saw the rise of violent extremism and the ideology and so forth. So these things are interconnected. When we're not present doing good humanitarian work, when we're not giving education, somebody else is. And it comes back. So it can be altruistic, it can be selfish, however you want to think about it. We have to not just assume that we're putting people in a holding tank for however long, 17 years or whatever, and think that it's going to be okay in the end. No, there is going to be blowback, and we've seen it over the last 17 years. And I'll start, and just one last thought to leave you. We've had 17 years of countering violent extremism and countering terrorism, being against something. We've spent $2 trillion, and all we've done is we've made the problem worse. We've metastasized it. We've given cover for the Myanmar government to be against Muslims as well. Now we have extremisms of every hue and every color. It's not working, folks, and so we have to rethink. Again, the politics goes with the humanitarian, goes with the human rights aspects.
So looking at how we address these, Habib, what does a durable solution look like for you, for the Rohingya community? And what advice do you have for Australian NGOs, ACFID members, as they seek to support what might happen next?
Yeah, because of Rohingya population has been the stateless from 1982, become de facto stateless person in the States, and the people has been, majority of them has been pushed out from the country, and the country, the ruler and the people, they are saying they not belong to that state. So that means this case is already the case of in the hand of international community. And United Nations top Human Rights Commissioner also said that the accountability in Myanmar is key to address the issue. So the international community has to interfere. They have to lead, whether repatriation or whether safe and dignity or whether relocation to their place of origin, or they have to find a third place, back to what happened in Nazi Germany. So this is similar type of case happening, because the state, the people, they are saying they not belong to here, they're not us anymore. So that means the people and the territory, they have to be separated. So that is ultimate solution. Or other words, this case is already on the table of Security Council. So international community, they know the best how to deal with this matter. And we hope Australia, as a member of international community and Security Council, they can join hands together, not just copying shadow sanction and avoiding top military general and sanction that is not effective. It is not work. They have to do more. And also to respect also the plight of Rohingya. For example, in those remarks, Rohingya people living in Australia more than 5-6 years, they are still with bridging visa, their cases are not processed. They've been hang around here. They've been told that they will be going back to where they come from or granting them temporary visa. This kind of thing, these are not the initiative to the plight of what been suffering to their family member. Now every Rohingya family member has been affected, including my younger sister in Bangladesh refugee camp, my sibling and my relative. Every one of them are in there. Every one of them are in inside refugee camps within the Rakhine state and also in Bangladesh. So it really needs to step in, including Australia. It is true to say the humanitarian aid is just for temporary purpose. That cannot solve for long, because there are a million of people. If you are going to provide $1 million, $1 to each of them, daily they needed $1 million. So for how long, how many humanitarian organizations in the world can provide support continually? So that's why political interference is needed on the right time. It is before too late. It is already late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Habib. So before we go to questions, Morten, can I ask you, in looking at Habib's advice there, what advice do you have for agencies in terms of this idea of intervening? How do agencies balance this idea of having humanitarian access, to be able to access the people who they seek to serve, as well as still speaking out on human rights?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of pressure now on everyone, including humanitarian agencies, to condemn, to punish, to leave perhaps even, all of course in the name of what we all seek, which is justice for the Rohingya. I guess my main message, or first message to everybody in this room, is that I would plead that you resist that pressure, that you stay where you are, that you continue to do what you do, because although this is at heart a human rights crisis, there are serious humanitarian needs within that crisis, and they need to be attended to for the foreseeable future. Now, having said that, I think there is a case for perhaps many humanitarian agencies to take this opportunity to reflect on whether the way you normally do things, deliver services, is enough in a situation like this. Maybe there is a case to do more to try to influence the kind of policies and practices on the ground that are leading to these humanitarian needs in the first place. So I think there might be a need even for humanitarian agencies to speak truth to power, so to speak. But you have to be smart about how you do this. And what do I mean by smart? I mean two things. First of all, for you guys, advocacy should be private advocacy. You shouldn't join your humanitarian colleagues on the pulpit. There's enough crowds there already. You should engage in private with the kind of people that you know, that you have relationships with, and that you may have some influence on. The moment you go on the pulpit, you will destroy those relationships, and you will limit your influence on the ground where it's very much needed. My second point about being smart would be you need to think about where your advocacy is focused, right? Nobody in Naypyidaw, which, in case you don't know, is the new capital, not so new anymore, of Myanmar, nobody in the central government is going to listen to humanitarian agencies. Your influence, or potential influence, lies at the local level, with local authorities, local security agencies, village headmen, the kind of people that you work with on a daily basis in the course of your project. Now, obviously, advocacy at that level won't change central government policy, but it can change, and this is important, it can change how that policy is interpreted and how it's implemented. So, to sum up, a time for reflection, absolutely, but not a time, as far as I'm concerned, for the humanitarian community to join their human rights colleagues and just do what they do. We need to do different things at the same time. Somebody talked about talking and chewing gum at the same time. That applies here as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Morten. I now invite some questions from the floor. Let's take a couple of questions. Please introduce yourselves. Come on, that was a juicy panel. There must be some great questions. Don't be shy. Yes, up here at the front. Just here.
Thank you. Michelle Higelin from ActionAid. Thank you. A really interesting panel, and I think there's a lot, so much to unpack in this area. And sometimes I think that we confuse, humanitarian crisis response with humanitarian relief. I think the crisis response needs to be much broader. I think, as we've heard from Habib, around the need not just to respond to those urgent needs of communities, but also those bigger issues of justice. And I think that is really important, that we look at how we can drive different approaches that recognise different organisations' strengths. And I would say, from ActionAid's perspective, we do work from a human rights-based approach in emergencies, and basic precepts around shifting power to local communities, promoting greater accountability to the affected communities, and also supporting women's leadership, recognising that women are often excluded. And I guess my question relates to this area, that I wonder whether sometimes there's a danger of perceiving humanitarian actors as neutral when, potentially we're part of that system of power, and we are part of protecting the status quo. So even by not speaking out and not saying anything, are we just reinforcing those existing power structures?
Great question. Do we have another question to take? Yes, just behind.
Sureka Gorin from Uniting World. Over the course of this panel in the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about how the structures and the institutions that we put in place in the 20th century to uphold human rights are broken. And we've had fantastic critique and analysis of the different ways in which they're broken and what are the key issues that are contributing to that. I'd be really interested in hearing from the panel about a vision for what are the structures and the institutions, or what are the things we need for the 21st century to the vision for the new thing that replaces the broken thing, that includes all the groups that were excluded in the last round, and really puts the Global South in the centre, and women and other marginalised groups are listened to.
Thank you. And do we have a final question before we go back to our panel? Yes? Right at the very back, yes?
Yeah, hi, Mark McDonald from Child Fund. Just a quick question, mostly for Robert. He mentioned that it is critical that we're able to hold governments to account. But when many of those governments have not signed the 51 Convention on Refugees, such as Myanmar, such as Bangladesh, your colleague talked about the Middle East, Jordan, Lebanon, and then relating to access, how do NGOs, how does the UN engage with governments so as the rights that we are trying to uphold are given to those who are seeking them?
So we might start with you, Robert, if you like.
Yeah, thanks for the question, although a lot of it I didn't actually get. I got the last bit, which was how does the UN engage with those countries to promote human rights in these humanitarian emergencies? Is that right?
No, my question was more, how do NGOs, how does the UN hold those governments to account, governments that have not signed that convention, but who are housing huge numbers of asylum seekers in their territory?
Okay, I'm still not sure I got that. How does the UN hold NGOs to account?
Governments to account if they haven't signed conventions.
Oh, okay. Well, the first, whenever people talk about the UN conspiracy to govern the world, Donald Trump in his last presentation of the General Assembly talked about, we will not be ordered around by a world government body. And for anyone who's worked in the UN, this is just such a ludicrous idea, because the UN is relatively powerless. It's any of you who work in large confederations at the international level, NGO confederations, you know that your authority for the most part is soft power. It's can you convince, it takes a huge amount of time to work with the members of the confederation or federation to reach consensus on issues, to agree joint positions. That is exactly the dynamics in the UN. The Secretary General doesn't even line manage the heads of most of the UN agencies, only the ones that are in the Secretariat. He's first among equals is the term. So even in his own, notionally his own organization, he can't instruct UNEP or UNDP what to do. They have their own governing boards for this. Or WMO, for example, or WHO, the heads of those agencies, what to do. So he can't do that in his own organization. His ability to do that, of course he doesn't have that authority in a sovereign state, but if a sovereign state has signed a convention, he can, both publicly and privately, or the UN can, point out that governments have obligations. Ideally, the transparent reporting on their commitment and their progress in achieving their commitments can be brought to their attention. At the end of the day, unless it's a really egregious violation that involves huge loss of life, as we've seen in Syria, where it's just dreadful bloodletting that's happening, the authority of the UN to actually force something to happen is very difficult, particularly when you have a multipolar world where you have powerful states that even one powerful state that doesn't want something to happen, doesn't want a decision in the Security Council to, I'm not implying any one in particular. So I think it's a very limited authority. It's soft power, it's publicity, it's lobbying, it's public statements and the like, but very little else, unfortunately.
Thank you. Who would like to take the question on shifting the power? Michelle's question first, and Morten.
I'm going to speak out of school here because I'm probably supposed to talk about Myanmar, but I want to offer a broader reflection. We've heard a lot about this broken international system, and I think the question, in a sense, is about what can we do about that. I think that the short answer is that it can't be fixed because the shift in power that we are seeing is happening, and it's going to continue for the foreseeable future. So the international system that we've been working within for the past 20, 25 years essentially has been based on the idea that there is power behind our ideas. In the current environment, that seems to be less and less the case. So how do we respond to that? I think when it comes to human rights, my line of thinking would be that the way we have traditionally promoted human rights, what the sort of the mainstream human rights community has been doing, and there are some people in here who perhaps subscribe to that, is through naming, shaming, sanctions, right? For that to work, there has to be power behind your demands. If there is no power behind your demands, you need to find a different way. Otherwise, the human rights community is just going to be left behind and rendered irrelevant. And I think that would be really, really sad because they have some very powerful ideas. So my very brief response to what can we do is we can't change the powers that are. We need to adapt to the new reality. And in order to adapt to that reality, we need to move away, and this resonates a bit with what Robert said, we need to stop thinking that we can change things through hard power, and we need to think more about how do we promote human rights through soft power, through dialogue, maybe through negotiation, even bargaining, but something other than simply turning up at the doorsteps of the countries that are not behaving and demanding that they comply with our demands, because that is simply not going to work in the world that we live in now.
And also in the last question as well on how do we have a system that is more inclusive of the global south as well. I don't know if you would like to also speak to that.
I'm going to throw out a bunch of ideas and see what happens. Okay, so on the question of human rights, one of the projects that we're working on is looking at it in terms of saying, instead of measuring economic and fiscal policy based on growth, why not measure based on delivery of economic and social rights and so forth, right? So it's actually looking at it and saying, are people getting water and shelter and healthcare and so, and it can be a combination of government and private sector, but based on the quality for the recipients as opposed to from the delivery side. But That kind of a conversation, I think, would actually be of interest to many countries in the developing world, because they have been so squeezed by structural adjustment that this might be a different way of, and looking at it from the standpoint of politicians and mayors and that more local level as opposed to just the government folks. So that's just a big idea to throw out there. Second thought, on the question of how do we bring the South into the conversation, this is a big conversation for our development community. In Washington, what I've seen over the years is that we have big organizations that get gigantic pots of money from USAID. Most of it sits in Washington or goes to their international staff or goes to their international staff's security in the countries that they're going to. So by the time it actually gets to the local level, it's minuscule. And then what happens is that they go in and they gouge out the local organizations and hire the local professional staff at, for more money but lower positions in their own national offices. And then when the money dries up because we're not interested in Iraq anymore and we've jumped to Yemen or Syria or wherever it is, we've kind of left nothing. We haven't actually done sustainable organizational building on the ground. And this is something that our sector has to think about, right? Because what you really need is civil society movements, organizations' capacity on the ground in the countries that we're talking to, because they don't have an exit strategy. They're going to carry on. So that's a revolution in our sector that I think we need to be thinking about. And then just one small thought. Many years ago, when my children were small, I went into their class and I did a 1 hour workshop with them around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I just said to them, imagine, you were writing the UDHR now, and set it up, World War I and World War II, and who was sitting at the table, and Eleanor Roosevelt and so forth. And I said, imagine you were writing it. What would be the rights and that you would want and responsibilities? These kids, age 9, came up with 20 of the existing items in the UDHR and a whole bunch of responsibilities around the environment. And then they wrote to Congress about the right to health care and the right to, that we shouldn't be torturing people. I mean, they as 9-year-olds started doing this work. And I thought, imagine if we could do this around the world, that we were actually taking and teaching the kids, and not teaching in terms of here are the rights, but actually eliciting from kids in different ages around how they think about this and having a debate about it. We need to, it's not public. It's not part of we haven't reached the hearts. We really haven't reached our own community's hearts, and we need to do that with the next generation if we're serious about these issues. Having a role versus the environment that we're in, which is to me the Kardashianization of our societies. It's basically brainlessness completely. So I think there's appetite for it, but we need to be a bit more creative.
Yeah, and to foster that. In our last couple of minutes, did Jane and Habib, do you have any last thoughts that you would like to?
Add a little. Yeah, based on the case of Burma, you see the international policy have been softening for 20, 30 years. And we see Australia has kept military tie for years and increased military aid. And also we have many Australian business sector investment, including Woodside Petroleum project in Arakan, more than 300 million investment. And also like many other, in the project in Arakan Bay, we have invested by more than 20 European nations, including India, Korea, Malaysia. I have not seen anything improvement. Even they have been engaging with Burma for a long time. They have been praising military. They have been softening their policy. Nothing changed in there. But still, attack going on. The attack going on against minorities, not only Rohingya. There are ongoing wars in Kachin, ongoing war in Shan State, displacement, massive displacement in there. So I have not seen anything develop. So why not we change our approach? This is time to change. That policy is not work anymore. This is practically happening on the ground. There's no time to praise this military and keep and then changing. Maybe change only the majority representative democracy or Buddhism representative democracy, not representing minority. Nothing mean for minority. Thank you.
Thank you, Habib. You all right? I would really like to I think this panel has provided us so much food for thought and a range of really valuable perspectives, and perspectives that really highlight what's going on in our everyday work, the kind of programs that you are running, the kind of challenges that you are facing. And I hope that they've encouraged you to be brave and courageous in some of those challenges you are facing, and really think outside of the box to see if we can really do things differently and really make the world a better place. So thank you so much to all the panellists. Thank you.
And I'd like to add my thanks and perhaps in a material way give some thanks to the panellists. Although in some ways it's been a sober session because there's been a lot of hard-hitting issues, it's been a very fitting way to end 2 days of the conference, which has been, I think, a real effort to lift our sights above our daily practice to the geopolitical and strategic. We've had some extraordinary speakers, both from Australia, but some of our international speakers, some of whom are on the stage, have been absolutely outstanding and really given us food for thought. It's within this panel, we can see the kind of mix we've had over the 2 days, a mix of academic, activist, practitioner, policymaker, personnel, and that, I think, is a nexus that's going to see us moving forward. So we'd like to give you a small gesture of appreciation. Thank you kindly. Can you do this? Oh, yeah. Sorry, this seems a bit like a game show or something, but I have my helper here too. Because I'm terribly conscious that people have planes to catch and they don't want us to drag out this bit of the event. But I want to just say a couple more words before I hand over to Mark. I just want to quickly reflect on the, Sanam talked about touching our hearts, and I think last night we had Larissa Berendt and Beiruz in different ways absolutely touch our hearts, and that's also been a great strength of this event, that we've been able to engage intellectually and emotionally, and I think at the end of the day that's what's going to achieve change. Most of you will know the allegory of the starfish, so I won't take you through it, but I do think we ought to leave here on a note of hope. We are living through extraordinary and changing and challenging times, but many of you in this room are making a difference, one person, one initiative, one community at a time, and we can't lose sight of that. And one of my board colleagues has given me a quote, which I think encapsulates it very well. Hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. It's an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. To hope is to give oneself to the future. And that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. So thank you to Susan, there she is, Susan Lagano, the CEO of Plan, for that. And that does bring us to the end of this conference. I want to thank all of you, particularly those of you who've stayed till the end. It's not a Friday afternoon, but even on a Wednesday afternoon, it's impressive that you're still here, because there is something about the wind down of a conference, even when you have this calibre of panel, that's hard to keep people, airline schedules and the like. The conference, I think, has been a great success, partly because of the participation of all of you in all of the sessions that we've had. It's been a great venue here at the University of New South Wales, and we appreciate the collaboration that's taken place with the university. A special thanks to our Auslan interpreters who have, are they here? Yeah. Are you still here? Yes,